Whether it's our military, our medical system, our economy, or even our own physical bodies, America is being crippled by the COVID response, especially under Biden. And now our greatest adversary appears to be preparing its next move. Just yesterday, Trump warned that we may now be facing war with China, who's lost all respect for the US under its weak and corrupt leadership. But if he's right, would it be a kinetic war or a more deadly biological weapon attack? Perhaps COVID 2.0. Or is it all just smoke and mirrors by the CCP, who's already in its death throes? Joining me today is JR Nyquist, a geopolitical expert who's studied China's playbook for decades. And if anyone has an idea of what the CCP's next move might be, it's JR Nyquist. So let's ask him all these questions and more on today's show. Welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse, and today, returning, I have Jeff Nyquist, a very special guest who I would say is an absolute expert in not only geopolitics, but communism and the communist playbook, especially as it relates to China and Russia. So, Jeff, so nice to see you today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, our last show we had, which was only a few months ago, and so much has changed since then and evolved. The last show was really focused on basically the question of whether China would be planning an attack on the United States. So, how about we start with just jumping into that and giving a little more background too for folks who are joining us for the first time now. What is China's plan? Do you think that there isn't a plan to attack America, and where do you think they're at with that right now?
Of course, nations have plans to attack each other. The United States at one point had an invasion plan for Canada, but these are contingencies. They're not necessarily proof. But years ago, I worked with a defector, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, who was a Russian military officer. He had been the debriefer for Gorbachev for a time. He became the second highest ranking Russian military intelligence officer in the United States. He was a deputy head of the GRU. And he basically said that to me that there was a plan that at the end of the Soviet Union, China and Russia had agreed to for a future war against the United States because China wanted the lower 48 states. It was a plan to destroy the United States. Russia would get Alaska and parts of Canada. China would get the lower 48. So you can imagine this is a pretty terrible war that they've envisioned. Other sources in China said that the D-Day for that plan would be 2035, that the Chinese hope to surpass us militarily in 2027, and then that they would be able to carry out the plan together with the Russian allies at the later date and their North Korean allies too. But something has changed in that plan. And you saw one of the things was Trump becoming president. Trump waged a kind of trade war, tried to restrict the way the Chinese got money out of us and was sucking us dry of our technology. That damaged the Chinese economy. It caused them they went into trade talks, but notice how nobody hears about that anymore because of COVID-19. The pandemic broke out just as these trade talks were concluded, and the Chinese had basically been forced into Trump's agreement. And then with COVID, Trump loses office, and we get, of course, Joe Biden into the White House, and then we lose Afghanistan. The Chinese, I understand, have occupied Bagram Air Base. The strategic positions lost, and even more important, we lost intelligence in Afghanistan. I am hearing from my sources that U.S. and allied spies throughout Asia are disappearing. They're either being doubled or they're just disappearing, assumed being executed. There was biometric data on 9 million Afghans that fell into the hands of our enemies, so that they know everyone in Afghanistan who cooperated with us, who had a pro-American position. And so they know who in Central Asia they can trust and not trust. So Afghanistan wasn't just simply the losing of a strategic position vis-a-vis China and Russia. It was a massive intelligence defeat. And this has yet to come out, I think. And what you want before you start a war is your enemy to be blind, to have no reports of what you are doing. Now, a year ago last May, I was receiving reports from sources with intelligence in Asian countries showing that Russia and China were contemplating this war that Lunev had talked about 2 decades ago. They were contemplating launching it in the near term. What is the near term? You know, a couple of years, 18 months, I don't know. Chinese sources have stated as recently as last May that war is only months away. We discussed this on your previous show. So that's sort of the background to this. And of course, what's interesting is my sources in Western countries say that the United States, behind closed doors with its allies, is very confident of victory against China, that they hope that there will be a Chinese aggression. I think the Chinese are completely mad for trying it, and that they will be crushed. So it's a quandary because the stated balance of power, what we can see is the United States and its allies are in disarray. We're suffering one defeat after another. We're behind the Chinese. The Chinese and Russians have incredible new missile technology, anti-ship, ship-killing, aircraft carrier killing technologies. And what do we have? We have an obsolete nuclear arsenal that within the next year and a half or so is going to be past its shelf life, according to the head of the Strategic Command. We're using Minuteman IIIs. We don't even have MX missiles, the newest heavy missile, which came out in the 80s. Minuteman IIIs, when I was a little boy, those were the missiles that we had for our ballistic missile. And I'm 63 years old. So this is really shocking for someone looking at the overt order of battle. But the question is, do we really know with all these black projects what the true nature of the balance of power is? This is the first question that I'd like to discuss, because I've really been looking into this, because I've been watching these revelations about UFOs. You've maybe seen the government has been admitting things, that there's something real to the phenomenon.
Yeah.
Of course, what is real? What does that mean? And the fact that there's a connection between technology the US may have been holding in a closet, or may be about to develop, that would change the whole nature of warfare, that is connected to this. And some observers, really sharp observers, are saying, why are they talking about UFOs? Are they about to make an announcement about some kind of revolutionary new technology that the United States has? And there's been so much disinformation and intelligence by various countries involved in this whole UFO. Believe it or not, there's one of the major ufologists wrote a book about alien contact and human deception and the development of secret technologies. So there's a shadow boxing game that goes on with all these things, because, I mean, science, the cutting edge of science is what decides wars now. And science and science fiction, they have an overlap, right? Or even incredible things that you and I can't really credit might be true. We don't know.
Yeah, they're not going to show us.
They're not, well, especially if there are military implications to the access to technology. I mean, if a German jet during World War II crashes in England, they're going to reverse engineer it, right?
Which is, I think, what you see happening with all of the weapon systems that were left in Afghanistan, which Trump actually put a statement out, interestingly enough, yesterday, talking about how the Russians and Chinese are already reverse engineering everything in Afghanistan, but also talking about he fears that we are potentially on the brink of war with China, who no longer has respect for the U.S. under the current administration.
Well, let's talk for a minute, because a lot of your listeners must be saying, "Oh, why would China go to war with the United States?" I see three possible reasons why we could be near a war. One is ideology, of course. The socialism, there is a ideological struggle, and we see it in our own country. We see it in the U.S. between socialism and the idea of capitalism, the idea of government doing everything, and freedom. of people to do for themselves. And these two different philosophies, China is a communist governed country. The Communist Party of China, it's a one-party state. There's no competition in elections. This is what they believe in. And the communist, if you study Marxism, Leninism, which is what the Chinese and the North Korean regime and the Cuban regime and the regimes in Southeast Asia are, and I believe that the people running Russia, the top people in Russia, still hold to those principles, although they cannot they cannot openly be that because the Russian people so detest the communist system. They've had to try to develop a kind of a hybrid system, greater Russia, so to speak. And by the way, there is even in China, there's a blending of what we know as National Socialist ideas of Hitler with the old Marxist-Leninist ideas, because they see that Hitler was very successful in motivating his people. So much so that even Stalin called the war against, in World War II, they called World War II the Great Patriotic War, right? So even Stalin used nationalism, and they realized that people aren't going to fight for abstract Marxist principles. And Mao was very realistic about this in my most recent article, as extensive quotes from Mao. People don't realize Mao said, "Oh, go out there and make friends with businessmen and people who are non-communist. Help them get rich, feed their greed, and make allies with them and help them to get power, because they don't want power for what they can do with it strategically. They want power so they can make money."
Yeah.
You
It's
know,
which is, if you look at what's happened with now, how the US in a lot of ways has fallen to its knees in front of China because of moving manufacturing over there, everything. It was not because we wanted power over China, it's because we wanted more money
we
and
want
better
it was good.
margins.
Yeah, it was the greed factor of individual business people and people in politics who saw themselves getting rich off of these deals. And Mao called it the Yunnan Way. Yunnan was the northern part of China that was created after the Long March, after Chiang Kai-shek threw the communists out of the Kuomintang in 1927. But as Mao explained it, he said, "Look, we're not going to sew up their pockets. Help them get rich. Get close to them. Use blackmail. Use bribery. Use all the tricks in your bag to get them to give us the positions we want." Now, Mao was very famous for saying, "Political power flows out of the barrel of a gun." And so he said, "Oh, they want to get rich? They want to make money? Oh, they think political power comes out of money bags, out of money." He said, "They can have all the money. We'll have all the guns. Then stick them up. We'll have all the money and all the guns." So this was kind of, in a nutshell, I'm boiling a lot of theory into something that the layman can understand. And that has been sort of the operating thing of China. You know, after Mao came Deng Xiaoping, who said it is glorious to get rich. So they were going to they realized they had to be built up. And so they were going to invite us over there to build them up so we could get rich off of their cheap labor. And then they could get this build. And what they've done is they've built the world's largest navy, an incredible tactical and anti-naval missile forces, very large air force. It's not the same quality as ours, but their numbers are incredible, what they can put in the air. Their alliance with Russia, that really was re-solidified at the end of the Cold War. You remember Gorbachev went to China. And then after that, there were all these talks, especially in 1999. Remember when we bombed Serbia, Belgrade, and we hit the Chinese embassy with a bombing raid, very stupidly, killed a couple of Chinese journalists. Of course, they were probably spies. But the Chinese then sent a military delegation openly to Moscow. And this began the open military collaboration between Russia and China that we had not seen during the period, since the Sino-Soviet split allegedly occurred, which this is, you've got some defectors that claim that this didn't occur. You've got Nevin Gusak, a researcher here in the US, who did a book, Was Golitsyn Right?, on the Sino-Soviet split, and massive facts showing incredible collaboration between Soviet Union and China during the periods of the Cold War when they were supposedly deadly enemies. So I think there's a case can be made we were played, but whatever happened back and then, they're definitely working together now in joint exercises. They had in 2018 an exercise which the Chinese and the Mongolians participated along with the Russians in a mock invasion of Alaska and a missile strikes on the United States. These kind of military exercises, of course, are very alarming to American officials. Um, so this is further background to kind of explain. So ideology and the past alliance rivalries could result in war. But then more immediately, you perhaps have heard of the grand solar minimum.
Yes.
And I've looked into this, for the past several years. I wrote about it for the first time last. I didn't even know that phone call was here. Sorry about that. Um, I wrote about this for the first time a year ago, July, and um, the grand solar minimum is a about 205 or 6 year cycle, and it's quite complicated, where the sun goes dormant for a period of decades, and the sun's electromagnetic field collapses. The sun does put out a little bit less heat. I believe the actual disk of the sun contracts slightly, and you have colder temperatures on the Earth. Now, I've corresponded with Valentina Zarkova, who's an expert in this in the UK. She was born in the Soviet Union, and I've talked to others and I've read a number of books on it. And this is real science. And we all hear about global warming, but the fact is a very serious cooling trend is coming. And global cooling is much more decisive for our politics here on Earth than warming. And of course, the real danger in this is food production. And we are already seeing a drop off of food production globally, not because it's gotten that much colder yet, because this grand solar minimum, by the way, the grand solar minimum began last year. So it coincides with the COVID epidemic. So it's like, did the Chinese intentionally release the COVID because the grand solar minimum was beginning and they knew there was going to be problems with the weather? Now, what Zarkova and others,
does that if I'm not mistaken, it will affect Russia and China first, right? Because that's where they're seeing droughts and they're having severe issues with crops there. Is that right?
Yes, and it's a very complicated subject because the Earth now is closer than the sun in its orbit. There's like a 700-year period now where the Earth is closer, and we're a couple hundred years into it, where the Earth is closer to the sun. The Earth's orbit moves further from the sun at times and closer. And it's going to be for the next, I think, 300 years. Maybe it's longer. It's going to be closer to the sun, except right now what's happening, and this is going to create in the next 2 years a problem. There's an alignment of the larger planets that is going to draw the Earth's orbit out so that in the summertime in the northern hemisphere, it's going to be warmer. But in the winter in the northern hemisphere, we're going to be a little bit further away from the sun. That's going to have an effect. Not that big of an effect, but it's going to have an effect. But what really happens with grand solar minimum, and try to make this, it isn't just the real cooling factor isn't just the sun's putting out a little less energy. It's the collapse of the sun's electromagnetic field that they really haven't understood until recently. And there's a scientist in Britain, Heinrich Svensmark. I mean, not in Britain, in Denmark, Heinrich Svensmark. His work is absolutely revolutionary. He has, for the first time over the last 2 decades, he's been working on this. And he's been persecuted for it. It's like Galileo. You can't say this, but it's been confirmed by scientists in Switzerland, is that the sun's electromagnetic field blocks cosmic rays from the Earth. And when it diminishes, more cosmic rays get through and they strike the oceans and they create more clouds. And these clouds then, a cloudy day is cooler than a sunny day. So the earth starts to cool very gradually at first. And there's also more rain in places, and there can also be droughts because what also
11-year
happens.
activity cycle. The North Pole
Wh-
becomes the South Magnetic Pole.
Sorry about
oh,
that.
I'm sorry. Did you were going to play that?
Oh no, it was just Marco was showing in the background for us,
In the
showing
background,
this
yeah, I heard
happening.
every 11 years there is a cycle with the sun where the basically what happens is the sun's electromagnetic field collapses, it reverses and re-energizes. In the grand solar minimum, the sun's electromagnetic field doesn't come back all the way. So anyway, uh, these what happens also with the collapse of the electromagnetic field is that how we have the prevailing winds that go from east to west and the jet stream, from west to east, the jet stream from west to east, and there's a kind of steady moving of air masses with some fluctuations north to south. Well, with this, you can have exaggerated movement of cold air from the north and warm air from the south. So you suddenly have these erratic things where, oh, wow, it's very warm in January, or it's really cold in October, September, like they're having at the end of September in Russia, because the polar air can be drawn down into Russia or China, like they had last year, snow in July in Beijing, right? Maybe you've seen the videos of it. I put them
Yeah.
up on my site last year because that's astonishing. It's snow in July in Beijing. That's crazy. You had just extreme weather conditions. We saw. I think you noticed there was snow in the Middle East and Libya last year. There was snow on the Acropolis last winter. You maybe saw that. Where in Greece, it doesn't really snow in Greece, so because it's pretty far south. It doesn't. This is so. What you're getting now is these fluctuations in weather that can affect crops. So you can have your harvest ready to go, and you're going to harvest in September or October, depending on your latitude, and suddenly this freeze comes in and wipes your crops out. Or in the spring, you've planted your crops and there's flooding. This has happened in China 2 years in a row now. They've had massive floods in China, and they lost. I heard a briefing earlier this year that China lost between 40 and 50%. I'm sorry, China had enough of a harvest to only feed 40 to 50% of its population. So you got 750 million people approximately that you have to find food for on the world market. And that's what the Chinese did. They were going to Argentina, they're going to the United States, Canada, Europe to make up the shortfall. This year, however, there was not only flooding in China again, where whole provinces lost their rice crops for all 3 seasons, but you have flooding in Germany, so you have a diminished wheat crop in Europe, and you had this drought in the United States, in the western states, that has really dampened our wheat production. And by the way, those very producers that were feeding their wheat to China were the ones that were most affected by this drought. So China is like having to dip into its reserves. They're telling the Chinese, tighten your belt, eat
Yeah,
less.
which when that message, I know last year there was a campaign all about, food waste, et cetera. When in a country like China, where they're the experts at hiding their weaknesses, especially from their own people. So when they're coming out and they're saying, "Hey, save your table scraps," basically, there's something really bad happening.
Yeah, there is, and the Chinese government's thinking ahead. So that is a real, you talk about, a lot of people don't realize World War II in part was caused by uh, a food issue. And people don't realize this. Germany in World War I starved horribly. The British blockade cut off their food. Central Europe, which was the Central Powers, Germany and Austria, uh, uh, and Turkey were the Central Powers. They did not have enough food growing capacity to keep their populations fed during a war in which they were cut off. they're fighting Russia in the east, they're fighting Britain and France in the west, and they were not able to feed themselves, so they basically starved. Various accounts of the war show that when the Ludendorff offensive happened after Russia collapsed, the German soldiers were demoralized by their very victory at the beginning of the offensive when they overran American and other Allied forces' trenches and saw their rations and compared those rations with their own. And it's
Mm.
like, they're eating what? And we're eating what? And it's like, it was very hard to take mentally. So Hitler, after the war, who came to power on the basis of a generation that had been starved, said, Lebensraum. You know, Lebensraum is a German word for living space. We need, and he wrote in Mein Kampf about having new territory for Germany and Ukraine, the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, so that Germany would never starve again. This is was a very attractive idea to Germans who had suffered so terrible during World War I and even after World War I, because the Allies kept the blockade into 1919 during the peace as an incentive for the Germans to sign that horrible peace treaty that ended World War I. 800,000 German children died of malnutrition after the war because the Allies had continued to impose the blockade. So these bitter memories were part of the trigger, because Hitler's strategy of expanding in the east and pushing into Czechoslovakia and Poland was part of this. We need more land, and so with China, you have this problem on steroids, because Germany, at least with bare rations, could get by in World War I and have people starve at the edges. But we're talking about them not, if they were isolated, they wouldn't, under these present weather conditions, be able to feed more than half their people. Imagine 700 million people starving. That's more than twice the population of the United States. It's a humanitarian catastrophe of unimagined proportions.
So they're basically, so as your main second point as to why we think that they're almost being forced into making moves militarily, is they are on the verge of having their entire country collapse, even just by looking at the food production alone. Not even to mention the financial system, the economy there, Evergrande, the defaults, or even looking at things like Three Gorges Dam. Or it's almost like heaven is really upset with China right now.
A Chinese mystic would say that the mandate of heaven had been removed from the communist regime.
Yeah, the
Snow in
emperor's lost
July.
that.
Yeah, the emperor, floods. The gods are angry with the Beijing. This is sort of traditional Chinese way of looking at it, and of course, it is. It may be driving this boat, because remember, the war plan was for China to get the lower 48, which is the lower 48 states is the biggest, richest food growing area. Even if the rest of the world's food production were crippled by the weather, we might be the only food exporter left. We would be the last food exporting country in the world to be able to do that if this grand solar minimum turns really severe. And if you're the Chinese regime and your war plan has always been to invade the lower 48 states, and I know it sounds fantastic, but if you look at Chinese literature, the Chinese have literally written essays, Chinese military theorists, that where did Hitler go wrong in World War II? This is fascinating. Hitler went wrong because he shouldn't have invaded Poland. He shouldn't have invaded France or the Low Countries or Scandinavia or bombed Britain. He should have just wiped out the United States, because then all those other countries would have just surrendered, because the United States was going to supply all these countries with the wherewithal to resist Germany. Without the United States, nobody can resist the Germans. Not even the Soviet Union, which depended on it, on U.S. Lend-Lease. So this is a fascinating insight into how the Chinese see their present situation. Why make a war over Taiwan or fight India or Japan or Australia? They're going to end up fighting the United States. Take out the United States first, and all the other countries surrender as a matter of course. This is really the core of their strategic thought, which I think a lot of American strategy analysts are missing. Because it's so fantastic to think that way, to think, what do you mean you're going to attack the United States first? Well, you see, and this is where if you've got 20, 30 years to plan what you're going to do, use a super EMP weapon on the Americans, use a biological weapon. And this is where we come to Chi Hao-chen's speech. 20 years ago, the defense minister of China, Chi Hao-chen, gave a speech to a select group of high-level party cadres in which he
And real
talked.
quick, so
Yeah.
that speech is on your website, right? So Marco,
Yes,
if you can pull it up.
Yeah, it's the second
It's
posting on jrnyquist.blog. If you just
yeah,
scroll
'cause
back through the articles.
when I read that speech and look at the fact that speech was 20 years ago, it was mind-blowing as to how real that is to what's happening right now.
Yeah, an American colonel who speaks fluent Mandarin, who was involved in translating that speech for the U.S. military, confirmed to me that it is real. The speech is genuine. And this speech is absolutely, like you say, mind-blowing, because he's saying, look, he even says at one point, this is tragic that we have to go against the Americans. But because China could collapse, and it's them or us, we need their land to survive, is basically what he says in the speech. We have to have that land. And the Americans have been good to us, but we need to, the party needs to survive, because he foresees if they cannot hold it together in China because of the environmental degradation, because of the collapse of their economy or their food supplies, the Chinese people will rise up against them and call them criminals and overthrow the Communist Party of China. And we see in the revolt in Cuba, look at Cuba has lost tourism because of COVID and has lost that tourism money, and the Cuban people are starving. And just with the mild, deprivation compared to what China would suffer in Cuba, you had this uprising against the communist government. In China, it would be much more severe, because they're sitting on such a mass of people that if they couldn't feed them, starving person has nothing to lose.
Exactly. Especially when a father sees his children starving. He's no longer afraid of the same people he would have been scared of.
So this is the second issue that is maybe driving China in this direction. And what I've heard from my Russian sources is that the Chinese have been begging the Russians to follow through on their promises to support them in a war against the United States, and the Russians, as would be natural, are dragging their feet, right? It's like, oh, we promised that. It's like, do we have to do a nuclear world war against America now? Timing is, of course, one of the issues. Can these countries actually pull together? It's one thing to make a nefarious plot. It's another thing to carry it out and actually do the terrible things you've agreed to do. So that's the other question. But the other one that could be driving Russia and China is that the United States may be on the brink of a technological breakthrough unlike anything the world has seen before. I mean, we've seen the breakthroughs in robotics. We've seen the breakthroughs in biotech that has got everybody up in arms, because it's, there's these ethical questions, moral questions. Do we want AI to be that smart? And is it dangerous to the human race? And do we have the right to play God to genetically alter, talk about transhumanism, the human genome, and create, super people or super soldiers that the Chinese are supposedly trying to create, which could be, you could be creating monsters. Talk about a chimera virus. What about a chimera human
Super
being?
soldier.
Right,
Exactly.
super soldier, right.
Yeah.
This is really terrifying. But here's the thing the U.S. has been working on. And now this is mind-blowing. There is a guy, his name is Dr. Pays. He applied for a patent in April of 2016 for a series of things. And I'll describe these to you, and you'll see what this is about. The first one is an electromagnetic force field generator. The second one is a high-frequency gravitational wave generator. The third thing is an inertial mass device, an inertial mass reduction device. And then the other one is, I think I read that out of sequence. I missed one of them. I'm sorry, a room temperature conductor. I missed the first one. A room temperature conductor. Imagine, whenever you conduct something over wires or whatever, you get heat and you get loss in the conducting process. This supposedly maintains room temperature, this is like the holy grail. Each one of these things is a holy grail if they have it. Now, my understanding is the patent office said, well, this is too incredible. The Navy said, oh no, this is real. The United States Navy backed this patent. So the patent was given in 2018. Now let me talk about the implications of these 4 devices. These 4 devices, if they are real, and if we have developed them already, would create basically an anti-gravity, faster than light propulsion system. Basically, they could basically bend space around a craft. Yeah,
which would change the dynamic of any war instantly.
It would change because you could create aircraft that could, first of all, the crew of this aircraft would not experience inertia. So imagine the maneuver capabilities, whether it was crewed or it was remotely controlled. You could make a right angle turn at 2,000 miles an hour and the crew wouldn't experience any G-forces. Who could, in a dogfight, the other guy's dead. They're just dead. And I guess how it works is, I've read a little bit about it. You have this electromagnetic field generator creates a vacuum that reverses the polarity, which then allows the inertial mass reduction device to operate to reduce the mass of the object. And also the force field generator creates a possibility for the high frequency gravitational wave generator, which is the gravity drive. It's just, the whole thing is mind-blowing that the Navy may have it. And what's really funny is in some of the drawings, the device itself is shaped like a pyramid. It's triangular, right? People have reported these triangular UFOs for years.
Exactly.
How long have they been working on this? You've also got part of the device looks like a Tic Tac. Remember the reports from the carrier pilots saying that
there's the Tic Tac UFOs.
The Tic Tac UFO. Part of it looks like a Tic Tac. It's like, what? And so you begin to think this UFO thing, and you begin to think about this incredible, and this thing can go underwater. It can go into outer space. It has the potential to go faster than the speed of light, because if you remove the mass of an object, then you can go faster than the speed of light, right? If this device, the inertial mass reduction device, really works, that means you could travel multiple, faster than the speed of light. This is incredible.
Yeah.
And it really is incredible. And to think that we have gotten here now, and this is the debate. Did we develop this just on our own? Maybe we did. Maybe we've been working on it. Yeah, there's these rumors that the Germans were trying to work on something like this during World War II. The Bell device, there's some really bad books and bad stuff on there, but there's some things that you go, maybe they were working on something. Hitler was talking about these super weapons. You have the Foo Fighters during World War II that nobody knew what that was. We don't know. The other thing is there's these stories about the Roswell crash. That something, ship or ships from another world were buzzing around New Mexico, where we had exploded the first atomic bomb, where we were testing the German V weapons, our own versions of them, our first rockets. They were snooping around and they crashed. And so, I don't know, you maybe saw just a few days ago, Einstein's assistant, Shirley Wright, who died in 2015, a tape of her talking about going with Einstein to Roswell to see the crashed craft and the alien bodies, that tape has now come out, surfaced now. And she's not the only one to make these claims. You have Stanton Friedman has interviewed a number of Roswell witnesses back in the 90s, put them on videotape, and you can find them. Most of them are on YouTube. And none of this is proof of aliens, but it's proof of something. And the story of reverse engineering alien technology is either a cover story for something we've been working on since World War II, or it's the real deal. I mean, you scratch your head and you try to figure it out. But so there's been something going on in terms of this technology, and people have said high up in the government, they've alluded to that there is that the greatest, deepest secret in the US government is really about the development of this technology that this patent has been issued for.
Which touches on the black budgets and all those things. But one question that I have in trying to piece everything together is, so going back to the speech that the Minister of Defense gave in China, he talked specifically about the need to basically to take over, to colonize America, and the justification for it, the survival of their own race. But he also spoke about why a biological weapon attack would be key in that, because they couldn't just come nuke us. They couldn't have a kinetic war, because they would destroy the land, and basically they'd be killing off the source of the food that they need. Now, if you look at what happened with COVID, maybe it was made in China, so it broke. It didn't work like they wanted it to. Most of us are still here. Do you believe that? But if you look at Biden in office and you look at the mandates are now enrolling, well, the two areas you see them really hurting us are the military, where people are leaving the military because of the mandates, and the healthcare system, where they're leaving. You have tens of thousands of healthcare workers quitting, which, in my opinion, it's almost like this whole process is setting us up for what could be the next wave of this. And so, what do you see unfolding with that?
Yeah, the real issue to me, going back to the Yinan Way, where Mao said, look, help these corrupt people in the West get rich. Show that you're their friend, and then they will hand things over to you. Their greed will allow you to get positions within their countries. And at that time, he was talking about the third world, but we can clearly see that has been the strategy of China's basic economic engagement with the United States for the last 30 plus years. And we see it in all these companies that have their factories over in China. And we see it with all the pro-China lobby in the US, and the almost impossibility to detach Wall Street from the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, this is incredible. Don't you realize the Chinese Communist Party, as Mao himself said, wants to liquidate all the people on Wall Street. They want to hang them all, put them all up against the wall and shoot them. But they have convinced them that they're their friends and that they will help enrich them. And they have the way to do it because they have the cheap Chinese labor, and they have certain Chinese access to minerals. I think China has been trying to corner the market on rare earth minerals. Of course, the Afghanistan defeat has really helped them in that, because Afghanistan was rich in those. Excuse me, but we have a real serious problem with our open political and economic system without the leadership to say, hey, these people are our enemies. And because these people are our enemies, we really can't let them into our economy and let them become close to major economic and political operators, so that you have somebody like Joe Biden who says, oh, the Chinese leaders, they're good people, right? It's like, they're good people. They have this Lao guy, this slave concentration camp system in their country. They arrest political prisoners. They disappear people who disagree with the regime. I mean,
mass organ harvesting trade.
Mass organ harvesting. Yep, state. I mean, these people they make the Nazis look good, right? In terms of, look at the Nazis killed 12 million people, in World War II. These people, the Chinese communists, have killed 60 million people. We don't even know the numbers And that's their own people. What opportunity would it be for them to kill 200 million Americans, which is a number given in Chi Chen's speech? We think we have to kill 200 million Americans. I mean, then you think about biological war, and getting back to your thing about why biological war is good, is that when you read Chi Chen's speech, it's clear that he wants his biological war to be a surprise and to be stealthy, so that the attack is not attributed to China, so they don't suffer the retaliation. And then your question about, well, what happened in this with COVID-19? COVID-19 is nothing. It doesn't, at first it seemed to be killing. People were talking about 6 or 7%. But I think, as that French Nobel laureate pointed out, is a chimera virus basically is going to mutate towards the common cold, towards being relatively harmless very quickly, right? And so you have this COVID-19 as a bioweapon, which they, by the way, compromised, I think, Americans to help finance the making of it, so that nobody could actually blame the Chinese, right? So people go, oh, it's the New World Order. It's the American, it's the evil banksters are doing it. And the Chinese they want us to help them develop this virus. If you look at David Martin's work, David Martin claims there's a patent. There's patents for this virus going back to 2003. And because Fauci was looking for a way to vaccinate us against AIDS and have a universal flu virus, and everybody was saying, oh, no, you can't do that. And somebody said, you can make an infectious virus that is like a vaccine. And everybody gets the sniffles, and now they're inoculated against the flu, and they're inoculated against AIDS, right? And of course, when he was working on this project, they said, you can't make a harmful virus in the United States, because that's against the biological warfare treaty. You're making a bioweapon. So his funding got cut off. And what did he do? Supposedly, according to Martin and others, he went to China and said, could you make this for us? We can cure all these diseases. The idiot, because he just handed the Chinese the very thing that they could then blackmail him with, compromise him, and compromise our own elements of our own CDC and National Institutes of Health. Anybody who signed on or was participating in this is suddenly in a very difficult position right now and has to lie to save their skin. And then we don't know about the whole, these mandates that you're talking about. Look, we have a lot of people that are, do not want to be involved in experimental medical treatment, both in the medical industry and in the military. So are we going to get 200 to 300,000 military people, veteran military people, exiting the military? We've got nurses leaving the hospitals and leaving the doctors, and doctors leaving the profession. You see how the medical system is almost before our eyes. It's losing its ability to cope with even basic matters. You go to an ER and there's a 15-hour wait.
Yeah. And we are being left wide open. We're being left in a very vulnerable situation.
And that raises the question of a more serious biological attack. The emergence of smallpox, bubonic plague. Smallpox is contagious, not as contagious as this COVID virus. Obviously, these measures we're having now would probably be good enough to contain smallpox. But what if people are just they now distrust the government because the government has gaslit them, or a significant portion of the population distrust the government, as we know they do. And then you have the healthcare system in a state of collapse. And then you suddenly have a very, very deadly, weaponized smallpox can be, 60% fatal. Imagine a weapon that's contagious, that can kill 60% of the people. And by the way, North Korean soldiers defecting across the DMZ, they've got antibodies to smallpox. They've been inoculated. Now, we don't even have vaccine for smallpox, because smallpox in the United States was eradicated a long time ago. And it was eradicated globally. There hasn't been a case of smallpox since the 1960s. If that disease reappeared, and I understand the weaponized form is very virulent, even the inoculation doesn't give you 100% protection. That basically you also will need antiviral medication for that. It's an extremely deadly deadly weapon. And by the way, one of our pharmaceutical companies is actually developing an antiviral smallpox medication, which is astonishing. So, and this is just speculation of what kind of weapon could be used, could it be deployed, but could you imagine the panic if there was a virus like smallpox that was 60% fatal? If people are panicking at something that's only killing 0.03% of the population,
Exactly. Well, I
it's
think especially because we're now the psychological toll this has taken on us and the fear of illness that's been, I think, used as a tool against, the world population. It's a mass psychosis that's already infected us. That even if something was even say twice as worse, 'cause I know there's different variants of COVID that they're warning about, and there's one that it's kind of has Ebola type um, kind of properties. It starts with an M. I forget the exact name of it that's been warned about. That it's like any number of these things. And again, it's like we're left on our knees for
mm,
the Chinese to move in. But one question I have is that even if we're in that state, do you think that China, which we're seeing, whether it's from the food supply or the economy or the people themselves rejecting communism, do you think that it's too great of a risk for them to attempt a war maneuver? Looking back, as you've mentioned before, some of the Soviet examples of what happened when they did that when their country was in such a peril.
the real question, going back to this technology, this anti-gravity drive uh, technology that the Navy seems to be saying that they have. uh, the information seems to be that it's a couple of years away. We're a couple of years away from them deploying something, right? 2, 3 years away from a new weapon system. Now, maybe we have some elements of it. Maybe it hasn't been built up enough. But if I'm a Chinese general and I'm saying the Americans are about to deploy a super weapon that will put us 50 years behind them, do you, as a Chinese general, you tell your government everything we've been working towards for the last 30 years is now in the waste bucket unless we strike now? So there's another incentive. And because we don't know whether the United States has already deployed these weapons, a new weapon, the Chinese and the Russians, with their really good espionage services, would be in a better position to know. I would guess they would have a pretty good idea where we are in this. And it's interesting. Like I said, very curiously, American sources on this war with China, ones at a very high level, believe that we would smash China and Russia in a war. Although, you know, that's behind closed doors. In public, they talk more like this is a real challenge and so on and so forth. And by the way, our top military people, and I'm gratified by this, when you watch their talks, these are 4-star generals. When you watch them talk about China or Russia in the strict military terms, they know China and Russia are aligned, and they talk about
Interesting.
this.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a question I have for you too, is because I know that when Trump was in office, it seemed like he was doing a lot of things to align himself with Putin. And there's a lot of people that believe that Putin is an ally of United States against China. But since I happen to think that I think Putin's more of an opportunist, and maybe when he saw Trump and his strength militarily, what he was doing, he was closer to him. But now that that situation has changed, that perhaps they have aligned with China, realizing that hey, we have a better chance of surviving if we align with the stronger of the two. But where do you think Russia is at with their alliance towards us and Trump?
Well, I don't think there is an alliance between Russia and Trump. I think that the dynamic between China and Russia and the U.S. is much more complicated. than an alliance. Nobody's friends at that level. Look, the Russians have the best intelligence service on the planet, and now they're sitting. One of my Russian sources, he said after the Biden-Putin summit, he said Putin is obviously in charge. He's in the perfect seat because look, China's in a desperate position. China needs Russia, and the United States needs Russia. Think about it. Let's say you've got this pretty lady and there's two men competing for her affections, right? Isn't she in a great position? She can take either one of them, whatever one is the best deal. Well, this guy's rich and this guy's handsome and whatever. So you have this very curious dynamic. And I think a lot of people, you talk to people in the American strategic community, and they're saying, we have to make Russia our ally. We have to play the Russia card. I think this is naive because I think, as I said before, there is an ideological commitment at the core of the Russian ruling group that they are still committed to the old Stalinist communist project. That's why Russia is basically they're promoting Stalin now. Stalin was the figure that led the Great Patriotic War. They're looking at another Great Patriotic War. Look, how can the Russian system, political system, survive with all these democracies around it in Europe and the United States? In the long run, we look at this Russian system, autocratic system, as archaic. It has to go. They have to give freedom to the Russian people. They have to let the Ukrainian people be free. And clearly they don't want to. So they know what side they're on. They're on the side with the Chinese. The Chinese aren't going to say, oh, you're not treating your people right, because the Chinese don't treat their people right. The Chinese don't care how the Russian government treats its people. The Western governments look at the inhumane way. I mean, look at Navalny's in prison in Russia. The Russian people are furious. There's been protests. The Russians want the same freedoms that they see the Europeans having. And the Russian state won't give it to them. The Russian state is a managed form of /socialist capitalism, just the same as China, based, of course, on oil and mineral production, basically exporting things that we need. Look at the gas, the way they've got Western Europe with their gas exports. Western Europe needs that gas to stay warm through the winter, and Russia's saying, yeah, you want to be warm in the winter, you got to be buddies with Russia now, using that as a weapon. But yet, if Russia commits to China, it's committing to war. Do they really want a war? And would that mean war with Europe, or could they keep Europe neutral while China and Russia destroy the US? And how far along is America in the development of this weapon? And can this new weapon system be neutralized with a surprise nuclear strike or through the sabotage of agents within the Biden administration? If people talk about the invisible government or the secret government and Majestic 12 and stuff, and what is that about? And this is a question I've always asked is there a secret level within our government that realizes our system that the CIA is useless, that the Soviets and the Chinese have penetrated our governmental systems, our intelligence, our
And everything.
everything, and they have. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming that we have massive communist subversion and penetration of our media, our government, everything. And it's like, but then there are these stories, and I hesitate to even mention them because they're not proof of anything. But I've been hearing them for years that there's a secret level in the US government that they said, okay, in the 1970s, the CIA is penetrated, it's worthless, but why get rid of the CIA or reform it? Let the CIA be out there and let the Russians think they're controlling our intelligence so that we actually have a real secret intelligence service that nobody even knows exists, that we're protecting the American people. And that way we can maintain American freedom because we don't have to then create a fascist dictatorship and start, jailing people for being on the left, right? Let them have their opinions, but protect them anyway. That's what some of the people I've talked to that claim this exists, but of course you can't prove it. You cannot prove these people exist. One guy years ago told me that at one point this secret intelligence service was run by George H.W. Bush in the 1970s, and he claimed to have been recruited to it. And I thought, I can't believe this story. This is too fantastic. But it's really weird because when I met George H.W. Bush, I was at a 2-day conference on North Korea where they announced that North Korea had nuclear weapons. And there were like 200 people there, very high level people, former secretaries of defense and for military and CIA people at a very high level. And I was actually seated next to the commander of the Marine Forces in South Korea having dinner, and I feel a hand on my shoulder. George W. Bush had entered the room, and of all the people in the room, he walks up behind me and puts his hand on my shoulder. It was very, very strange because I had been writing about the threat to this country and taking a lot of flack, and it was just weird. It was a weird coincidence. And I remembered what this guy had told me years before, that there's this secret level, and people talk about the Bushes being evil and being compromised, and maybe they are, or maybe they're pretending. This guy told me, he said, the Russians are really great at infiltrating and using active measures, but we're really great at sting operations. Let them think they've won. Suck them in, let them show their hand, and then defeat them. I've got people, I talk to people who have intelligence background, and they shake their head and they say, no, Jeff, that doesn't exist. That does not exist. They are running circles around us. We are suffering one defeat after another, and we see Afghanistan and we see what's happened in our media, and it's like, if there was this level, would they have allowed us to get to the point where we have communist mobs running through our streets, pulling down statues of George Washington, like happened last year? There's so much complexity in unraveling this that you're just humbled trying to piece it together, trying to understand it. To go with my judgment from what I've known from years of study, there is great danger right now because the communist bloc didn't really disappear. We have a modified form of it that survived, that's now militarily on paper stronger than we are. And we should get into this, but economically very vulnerable. And we should maybe discuss, my theory always has been that we would weaken, they would subvert us, and they would be encouraged to attack. And they would lose, not because we have a super weapon, which we may have, but they would lose because their economic and political theory is flawed. And that the economic system which drives their militaries, both in China and Russia, would collapse as soon as they attacked us.
Because
within
that war
weeks.
would expose the reality of their economies.
It would expose, because what these managed socialist economies, market economies do, is like in China, every single company in China of significance has a secret party committee, which has the final say on all the investment decisions. And what we have after, since the last Asian economic crisis, is we have more than 2 decades of malinvestment in China. They have no money because when you malinvest, you put all this money and resources to making things, and there's no profit from it in the future. You don't make up that money. You have massive
losses.
Right, building ghost cities. You have massive economic losses that you're hiding in your phony banking system. And now this is showing up in China now. So they have, in addition to a food crisis, they have a financial crisis. And now they have an industrial crisis because in their trade war with Australia, tiny Australia, they have completely destroyed the balance within their own economy on energy production because of their price controls. Ludwig von Mises famously wrote a book called Socialism, in which he described the fatal flaws in a socialist economy. He said, the fatal flaw is since they don't have a true market system, they can't tell when they're running out of things to be able to go in and develop the infrastructure to produce those things. Because in a market system, if you are, a perfect example is energy here in the US. Remember when oil was, they were talking about peak oil, and oil was going over $100 a barrel, and it's going to be $150 a barrel, and kind of flirted with that number. And then all of a sudden, we didn't have any energy problem. All of a sudden, we developed these new technologies like fracking, and we're able to drill deeper and to exploit new oil finds all over the world. And suddenly, there we're afloat in oil again, and America's even energy dependent. Because why? Because the rise in the price made it worth it to invest in the technology to solve the problem. That's capitalism. But you look at China now. Here they have this little spat with Australia, trying to bully Australia. And the Australian Prime Minister said, we got to investigate this COVID and how it actually came out of China. And the Chinese were like, you're not doing that. We're going to punish you for that. And the spat evolved into this trade war in which tiny Australia, you'd think they were totally vulnerable, but they have a market economy. They were able to adjust to the hits that the hurts that the Chinese put on them, but the Chinese didn't notice the coal they were importing, for example, from Australia, the high quality coal. They since they were regulating their coal, they didn't realize they had a problem until now. They're having brownouts. They're sending people home from factories. You talk to anybody that is doing business in China. I talked to I follow the development of military simulation games. A friend of mine, they've got games they send to China because China has the best production for these games. And they're like caught off months behind because the Chinese factories have these shutdown schedules because there's not enough electricity to operate them because of what they've done. And that's because they don't have a real market economy. And then there's other inputs. There's spare parts and things that are made in other countries. They go to war against the West. They're cut off from Europe. They're cut off from Japan. They're cut off from the US. All of a sudden, how long before those inputs crash their economy and put them back in the Stone Age? This is literally what von Mises predicts in his book, Socialism. He said, a true socialist economy is a Stone Age economy where a sharp piece of rock that you find on the ground that you can make an arrowhead out of is about all you've got. Right? Because any complexity of trading, and you look at all the little parts of things that are made here and there, pieces of plastic, molds for metal things, machine tools. It's so nobody can keep track of that. It's too complicated. But the pricing system of the market, you see the price rising, you are an entrepreneur, you want to make money, you go and you make it. And real confirmation of this is found in, Kotkin's third volume. I'm not sure if it's come out yet. I keep looking for it, on Stalin's biography, Stalin at War. And he confirms something I've always suspected, that the Soviet economy, you read about the Soviet economy and it's very fascinating. They call it the Stalin command economy. It was a myth. They had a market economy, a black market economy, operating underneath where everybody cheated and broke the rules, and operated a black market economy to tell what the prices were, and that allowed them to keep the economy and the industries going. And the people were enriching themselves, and the factory owners were like, of course, if they got caught, right? But this developed. This is how the Russian mafia became so powerful in the Soviet Union. This black market capitalism underlining this command economy. Well, when World War II began, they tightened everything and said, you know what? We are not tolerating any violation of the rules. We have to have this command economy because we have to produce the war materials. And everybody said, all right, we'll follow the rules. We won't operate this black market thing. Soviet economy, says Kotkin, after the German attack and they tightened up their economy to a true command economy system, it collapsed. Here they had this vast copper industry in the Urals, and they couldn't produce copper because different parts ceased being made. They had to import copper from the United States. That's how they were able to make it. The United States filled the needs that their collapsed economy was missing. Because you hear about supply chain and supply chain problems. In an economy, imagine you've got some little piece of something that helps your economy operate. You don't have it anymore. Your mining industry breaks down. Your factories break down. Right? And it's like, if you can't go abroad to get those things, you flatline economically.
So China's really in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation
They are.
where, and we know, I mean, I've been studying some of the financial aspects of China's economy recently and looking at just the debt they've lent out, the amount of money that's in non-performing loans that the banks are holding. It's like everything points to this fact that it's like they have such a narrow path to get through this next stage of history and survive, and it looks like they will not. Now, one question I have is that for people in America, or really all over the world, but especially in America, which is the target of this, what do you recommend for the average American to do right now in terms of preparing, being proactive? Like, if we are on the verge of war, what should we do? I think the first thing is recognizing that we are in this stage, and that's what I'm trying to do with
Yeah.
my shows, helping people understand where we're at in history. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, if you live in an area where you have access to wood fuel, get a wood burning stove. Because if the electricity goes down, if they attack our electrical grid, you will have heat in the winter and a way to cook food. And then also stockpile food. Have 6 months, 9 months, ideally, supply of food, because if our system is collapsed, if a war lasts, as I conceive it, modern war like this could last a year and a half, it's very destructive. But it's the economic effects, the deprivations that people will suffer. So, will the food infrastructure go through a temporary collapse? Will there be massive food shortages? Will there be shortages of heat and energy for cooking and for keeping yourself warm in the winter? So that's what I would advise people. Those are the two things: food and fuel that you might have, to be sufficient in. Those are things that you kind of want to do as an American. And the more Americans that are sufficient, I mean, it might be that only a couple people in a neighborhood do it, but everybody could huddle in their house, and survive. So don't think that it's, the EMP, Peter Pry is a friend of mine, and he was on the EMP Commission. And they determined that if an EMP strike against our grid happened, that we would have, up to 80% of the Americans would die
Within a
because
year.
within a year, because the grid went down and they just didn't have enough food, with the distribution breaking down and the heating system and everything, and it would totally destroy the social harmony and order too, because people would be desperate for these things. But if people can be very heroic in a time like this, and if some people have prepared, it's amazing. It might make a huge difference if the worst happens. And we're talking about the worst. I mean, obviously the Chinese don't want to use an EMP weapon on the US, a super EMP weapon. They might use EMP weapons regionally or locally, because if you melt down all the nuclear, an EMP attack, a true EMP attack, as I understand it, would melt down all the nuclear reactors. There's like 100 of them in North America. And that would, to talk about Chernobyl times 100, or,
They'd be killing off their
Fukushima.
farmland.
Right. You're destroying the water table, which is needed for farming. The water table in most places in the United States, east of the Rocky Mountains, because most of the nuclear plants are east of the Rockies, would be contaminated to the extent that you really couldn't live there or grow food there. And that would defeat the whole purpose, of what the Chinese are trying to do. That's why maybe the most insidious thing is what is the biological element in this attack,
Yeah.
which we don't know. There's so many mysteries about the virus, so many mysteries about how, well, I think obviously our health system is broken. The response we have a lack of leadership in this country. One of the things about war and economic hardship is that it does seem in Western countries and countries like ours to bring out the best leaders. And so I don't think we're doomed in that respect either. I think there's intelligent, good leaders out there who are they've been marginalized and sidelined because of our cooperation with China. Look at Hollywood can't make a movie in which the Chinese, they wanted to make Red Dawn with the Chinese invading instead of the Russians. Remember that movie from the
Oh,
80s,
yeah.
Red Dawn?
Yeah, it
And they
became
were
North
going to,
Korea, right?
right? And they couldn't. The Chinese had such a hold on Hollywood. They couldn't make the Chinese the bad guys. They had to make the North Koreans invade North America, which is completely preposterous. A North
Yeah.
Korean invasion of the United States. But they couldn't. They literally couldn't do that because China wouldn't allow them. So the influence here of China, if once a war happened, that would be over. Once they step beyond a certain point, we would be able to, in some sense, recover our sense. But just think of all the journalists, all the experts, quote unquote, who had been cozy to the Chinese, who would be regarded in the event of some horrific war as basic traitors before the fact.
Traitors. Yeah.
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 Yeah, there would be a different intellectual climate, our whole psychology would change. And this is a fascinating topic in itself. How would that psychology change?
Yeah.
How would Americans think differently?
Well, so Jeff, I realize now we're actually approaching an hour and 20 minutes. And what we normally do is we go over to Rise TV, which is where it's our kind of uncensored play space for some, one-on-one Q&A with some of the folks over there. So we're going to be, I'll let everyone know that if you want to hop over to Rise, there's a link for the free trial in the description. For those of you that want to support me, I'm a part of the Rise team. So supporting Rise helps to support me. And even if you come over there just for the show and you cancel, it's a free trial. I won't blame you. I do that all the time. But if you want to hop over to Rise TV, again, the link is in the description where we're going to be live over there. Because Jeff, I have a few more questions. I want to talk about specifically your thoughts on the vaccines, which is obviously something we can't talk about on YouTube. And then we've got some good questions from the folks over there. So thank you all that have joined us on YouTube, Facebook, and Rumble. I'm going to go ahead and turn those off quickly here. And then we will be hopping over to Rise TV.